Arzitintes, how wine became humanity's most influential drink. There's a liquid that has shaped civilizations, sparked revolutions, sealed treaties, inspired religions, and funded empires. It's been called the blood of Christ, the tears of the gods, and the most civilized of all beverages. For thousands of years, wine has been far more than just a drink. It's been currency, medicine, status symbol, and sacrament. This is the story of how wine became humanity's most influential drink. Our journey begins roughly 8,000 years ago in the South Caucasus region, in what is now Georgia, Armenia, and parts of Turkey and Iran. Here, nestled between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, early humans made one of the most significant discoveries in history. They found that if you took the juice of wild grapes and left it in a container, something magical happened. The natural yeasts on the grape skins would consume the sugars in the juice and transform it into something entirely new, wine. The earliest archaeological evidence of winemaking comes from a site called Gadatrili Gora in Georgia, dating to around 6000 BCE. Researchers found ancient pottery jars with residues of tartaric acid, the chemical signature of grapes, along with other compounds that indicated the grapes had been fermented. These weren't just containers that had held grape juice. They were wine jars, vessels specifically designed for fermentation and storage. Our ancestors had figured out not just how to make wine, but how to control the process. Think about what this discovery meant. For the first time, humans could preserve the essence of the grape harvest long after the fruit had rotted away. They could create something that was not only nutritious, but also mildly intoxicating, offering a temporary escape from the hardships of ancient life. Wine was safe to drink when water sources were contaminated. It had antiseptic properties. It could be traded, stored, and transported. And perhaps most importantly, it altered consciousness in a way that seemed divine. The early winemakers of the Caucasus weren't just stumbling upon fermentation by accident. Archaeological evidence shows they were deliberately cultivating grapevines, selecting the best varieties, and developing sophisticated winemaking techniques. They used large clay vessels called vevri, buried in the ground to maintain stable temperatures during fermentation. This wasn't primitive experimentation. This was systematic viticulture, the beginning of an industry that would eventually span the globe. From the Caucasus, wine culture spread in multiple directions. It moved south into Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians were among the first to write about wine. Cuneiform tablets from ancient Sumeria contain references to wine, its production, and its trade. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest written stories, mentions wine multiple times. In this ancient civilization, wine was already stratified by quality and price. There was cheap wine for common people and fine wine for the elite. The social hierarchy of wine had begun. Wine travelled west into Anatolia and then to ancient Egypt. The Egyptians didn't have ideal grape-growing conditions in their hot, dry climate, but they were absolutely obsessed with wine. Egyptian tomb paintings depict entire winemaking processes: harvesting grapes, crushing them in large vats, fermenting the juice in jars, and sealing the vessels. Wine was so precious that it was buried with pharaohs to sustain them in the afterlife. King Tutankhamun's tomb contained 26 amphorae of wine, each labelled with the vintage, the vineyard, and the winemaker's name. Yes, 3,300 years ago, the ancient Egyptians were vintage dating their wine and tracking provenance. But it was the ancient Greeks who truly elevated wine from a commodity to a cultural cornerstone. The Greeks didn't just drink wine, they philosophized about it, worshipped it, and built an entire social structure around it. They had a god dedicated to wine, Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, theatre, and religious ecstasy. The cult of Dionysus was one of the most important religious movements in ancient Greece, and wine was central to its rituals. The Greeks developed the symposium, an institution that was part drinking party, part intellectual salon, part religious ritual. After dinner, Greek men would recline on couches and drink wine mixed with water while discussing philosophy, politics, poetry, and current events. The symposium wasn't just about getting drunk, though that certainly happened. It was about creating a space where wine loosened tongues and opened minds, where social bonds were formed and ideas were exchanged. Some of Western civilization's most important philosophical concepts were debated over diluted wine at Greek symposia. The Greeks were wine snobs of the highest order. They categorized wines by region, grape variety, and age. Island wines from Chios, Thasos, and Lesbos were particularly prized. They aged wine in large clay amphorae, sometimes for decades. They understood that wine changed with time, that it could improve or deteriorate. They added herbs, spices, honey, and even seawater to their wines, creating complex flavoured beverages that would seem strange to modern palates but were considered refined luxury in their time. Crucially, the Greeks were wine evangelists. Wherever they established colonies around the Mediterranean, from the Black Sea to Spain, from North Africa to southern Italy, they brought grapevines with them. Wine was Greek culture in liquid form, and spreading wine meant spreading Hellenistic civilization. The Greeks didn't just export wine, they exported viticulture itself, teaching conquered and allied peoples how to grow grapes and make wine. When the Romans conquered the Greek world, they inherited this wine culture and amplified it 1,000-fold. The Romans turned wine from a luxury into an industrial product. They systematized viticulture, studied it, wrote agricultural manuals about it. Columella, Pliny the Elder, and other Roman writers produced detailed texts on grape growing, winemaking techniques, soil types, pruning methods, and wine storage. Roman knowledge of viticulture was so advanced that much of it remained the foundation of European winemaking into the modern era. The Romans also democratized wine. While the wealthy still enjoyed premium vintages from famous regions like Falernian, even common soldiers received a daily wine ration called the posca, a mixture of wine, water, and sometimes vinegar. This wasn't a treat, it was standard military provision. Roman legions marched on wine. It provided calories, vitamins, and safe hydration. It also provided morale, a taste of civilization even on the remote frontiers of the empire. Roman expansion meant viticultural expansion. As the legions pushed into Gaul, Germania, Hispania, and Britannia, they planted vineyards. Roman soldiers and settlers wanted wine, and the most economical way to supply it was to grow grapes locally, rather than transport wine over vast distances. The Romans established the great wine regions of Europe: Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Rhone Valley, the Moselle, Rioja. These weren't accidental choices. Roman agronomists selected regions with the right combination of climate, soil, and topography. 2,000 years later, these remain some of the world's finest wine-producing areas. Wine also became central to Roman social and political life. The dinner party, inherited from Greek symposium culture, was where Roman politics happened. Senators, merchants, and generals forged alliances, made deals, and plotted against rivals over wine. The quality of wine you served said everything about your wealth and taste. Serving old Falernian wine that had aged for decades was the ultimate status symbol, the Roman equivalent of opening a bottle of Romanée Conti today. But wine's most profound transformation came with the rise of Christianity. Jesus Christ's first miracle, according to the Gospel of John, was turning water into wine at a wedding in Cana. More significantly, at the Last Supper, Jesus took wine and declared it to be his blood, establishing the ritual of the Eucharist that would become central to Christian worship. Wine wasn't just symbolically important to Christianity, it was literally essential. Without wine, you couldn't perform the most important Christian sacrament. This gave wine a sacred status it had never quite achieved before. The Romans had associated wine with their god Bacchus, but wine itself wasn't holy. In Christianity, consecrated wine became the blood of Christ. This meant the church needed a reliable wine supply for communion. It meant monks and priests needed to understand viticulture. It meant that even in regions where wine didn't grow naturally, Christians would try to cultivate it. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE could have been the end of European wine culture. Barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and social chaos destroyed much of Roman civilization. But wine survived, protected by the one institution that remained stable, the Catholic Church. Monasteries became the guardians of viticultural knowledge. Monks didn't just maintain vineyards for communion wine, they became Europe's premier winemakers. Monastic orders, particularly the Benedictines and Cistercians, turned winemaking into both a spiritual discipline and a science. They had several advantages. They had literate members who could read Roman agricultural texts and keep detailed records. They had stability, remaining in one place for generations, allowing them to observe how different vineyard sites performed over decades. They had the resources to experiment and the patience to wait for results. And they had a theological motivation. Making excellent wine was a way to honor God. The Cistercian monks were particularly revolutionary. They divided Burgundy's vineyards into tiny parcels called climates, observing that grapes from one patch of hillside made wine that tasted distinctly different from grapes grown just a few meters away. This was the birth of terroir, the concept that wine expresses the specific characteristics of its place of origin. The monks didn't understand the geology and biochemistry underlying terroir, but they observed its effects and acted on that knowledge. The vineyard classification systems they developed in medieval Burgundy still exist today, nearly 1,000 years later. Monasteries also innovated in winemaking techniques. Monks in Champagne, most famously Dom Pierre Pérignon, worked to control and refine the secondary fermentation that created sparkling wine. German monks developed techniques for making sweet wines from late-harvested grapes. Spanish monks fortified wines with brandy, creating sherry. Monastic winemaking wasn't just about preservation, it was about improvement and innovation. Wine also became economically crucial to medieval Europe. Cities and regions built their prosperity on wine trade. Bordeaux's entire economy revolved around wine production and export, particularly to England, after Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage to Henry II gave the English crown control of southwestern France. Bordeaux wine, called claret by the English, became the preferred drink of the English aristocracy. Wine taxes funded wars, built cathedrals, and enriched merchant families who would become the banking dynasties of the Renaissance. The wine trade also drove technological innovation. Better barrels were developed to transport wine safely. Improved glass-making techniques allowed for bottles that could age wine. The cork, harvested from cork oak trees in Portugal and Spain, was perfected as a bottle closure, creating an airtight seal that allowed wine to age for years or even decades. These might seem like minor technical details, but they transformed wine from a product that had to be consumed within months of production into one that could improve with age and be transported around the world. The age of exploration spread wine culture globally. Spanish conquistadors brought wine to the Americas, establishing vineyards in Mexico, Chile, Argentina, and California. They needed wine for religious ceremonies, but also as a taste of home and a trade commodity. The missionaries who accompanied Spanish colonization planted vineyards at every mission they established. The mission grape brought from Spain became the foundation of New World wine production. Wine also became a tool of colonization. European settlers in South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand planted vineyards as a way of claiming and civilizing the land. Making European-style wine in these distant colonies was a statement. This land is now part of our world. The Dutch East India Company established vineyards in South Africa's Cape region specifically to supply wine to ships travelling to Asia. Wine wasn't just cargo, it was a portable piece of European civilization. The 17th and 18th centuries saw wine culture reach new heights of sophistication in Europe. The wealthy began collecting wine, building cellars to store thousands of bottles. Wine auctions became social events. Wine criticism emerged as a profession. The English, despite not producing much wine themselves, became the world's wine connoisseurs, importing, blending, aging, and trading wine from across Europe. English merchants in Bordeaux effectively created the modern Bordeaux wine classification system, identifying the best chateaux and willing to pay premium prices for their wines. This period also saw the emergence of branded wines. Dom Perignon's champagne, port from specific Portuguese houses, sherry from particular Spanish bodegas, these weren't just generic wines but products with specific identities, reputations, and premium prices. Wine was becoming a luxury good in the modern sense, with branding, marketing, and quality guarantees. The French Revolution brought dramatic changes to wine culture. The revolutionary government confiscated church and aristocratic lands, including many of France's best vineyards, and sold them to the emerging bourgeoisie. This democratized wine ownership, breaking up large estates into smaller properties. It meant more people had a stake in wine production, more families built their identities and fortunes around their vineyards. It also meant more competition and innovation as newly empowered winemakers sought to distinguish their products. But the 19th century brought catastrophe. In the 1860s, a tiny insect called Phylloxera, accidentally imported from America, began destroying European vineyards. This aphid-like pest attacked grapevine roots, killing the plants. It spread across France, then Italy, Spain, Germany, and eventually most of Europe's wine regions. Entire vineyards were wiped out. Wine production collapsed. Families that had made wine for generations were ruined. It was an ecological and economic disaster. The solution came from an unlikely source: American rootstock. Native American grapevines had evolved alongside Phylloxera and were resistant to it. European wine grapes, having never encountered the pest, had no defense. French viticulturists discovered that if they grafted European grape varieties onto American rootstock, the vines would survive. It was a massive undertaking, requiring the replanting of nearly every vineyard in Europe, but it worked. European wine was saved by marrying European grapes to American roots. The Phylloxera crisis had lasting effects. It forced winemakers to reconsider everything about viticulture. Which grape varieties should be replanted? Which vineyard sites were worth the investment? It also led to the creation of wine regulations and quality control systems. France established the Appellation d'origine contrôlée system in the early 20th century, defining which grapes could be grown where, what winemaking techniques were allowed, and what could be called Bordeaux, Burgundy, or Champagne. These regulations protected regional identities and quality standards, but also codified tradition and limited innovation. The 20th century saw wine become truly global. New World wine regions in California, Australia, Chile, Argentina, South Africa, and New Zealand moved from producing cheap bulk wine to crafting world-class bottles that could compete with European classics. This was partly about technique, learning from European masters, but also about rejecting European conventions. New World winemakers experimented with grape varieties, blends, and methods that would have been illegal in France or Italy. They embraced technology, stainless steel tanks, temperature-controlled fermentation, scientific analysis of sugar levels and acidity. California's Napa Valley became the symbol of New World wine's rise. At the famous 1976 Judgment of Paris tasting, California wines defeated prestigious French wines in a blind tasting judged by French wine experts. It was a shocking upset that challenged centuries of European wine supremacy. California wines weren't just acceptable, they could be excellent, world-class, worthy of serious attention. This opened the floodgates for other New World regions to gain credibility and market access. Wine also became democratized in the 20th century. Refrigeration, improved transportation, and modern bottling techniques meant fresh quality wine could reach mass markets at affordable prices. Wine wasn't just for the wealthy anymore. The middle class in America, Europe, and increasingly Asia could afford good wine. Wine bars, wine education programs, and wine tourism made wine culture accessible to ordinary people, not just connoisseurs. The health wine paradox added another dimension to wine's influence. In the 1990s, scientists noticed that the French, despite eating a diet rich in butter, cheese, and other saturated fats, had relatively low rates of heart disease. Some researchers attributed this to moderate red wine consumption, suggesting that compounds in red wine, particularly resveratrol, might have cardiovascular benefits. The French paradox sparked a boom in red wine consumption, particularly in the United States. Whether the science fully supported this was debatable, but it gave people permission to feel virtuous about drinking wine. Wine also became an investment asset. Rare wines, particularly from Bordeaux's first growths and Burgundy's Grand Crus, began selling for thousands or tens of thousands of dollars per bottle. Wine funds emerged, allowing investors to speculate on wine futures. Collectors built climate-controlled cellars worth millions. Wine auctions at Sotheby's and Christie's featured bottles selling for prices that seemed absurd for something meant to be drunk. The 2000s saw Chinese buyers enter the market aggressively, driving prices for prestigious wines to unprecedented levels. This financialization of wine has been controversial. Critics argue it's disconnected wine from its purpose, to be enjoyed with food and friends, and turned it into a commodity for speculation. Defenders counter that high-end wine has always been a luxury good and status symbol. The real issue might be that the gap between everyday wine and trophy wine has become a chasm, with different rules, markets, and cultures. Modern winemaking is caught between tradition and innovation. On one side are those who believe great wine comes from minimal intervention, respecting terroir, using traditional methods, and letting the vineyard speak. Biodynamic and organic viticulture have gained followers who see wine as an agricultural product that should reflect its place and vintage without excessive manipulation. These winemakers use native yeasts, minimal sulfites, and techniques that would be recognizable to a Roman or medieval monk. On the other side are those who embrace modern technology and science. They use cultured yeasts for predictable fermentation, employ reverse osmosis to concentrate flavors, use oak chips instead of expensive barrels, and analyze their wines chemically to achieve specific flavor profiles. Critics call this Coca-Cola-ization of wine, creating standardized products designed for mass appeal. Defenders argue they're making good wine accessible and affordable. Climate change is now wine's greatest challenge. Rising temperatures are shifting which regions can grow which grapes. Areas that were once too cool for wine production are becoming viable. Traditional wine regions are struggling with heat waves, drought, and changing weather patterns. Champagne houses are buying land in southern England, preparing for a future where French vineyards might be too hot for the grapes they've grown for centuries. Winemakers are experimenting with drought-resistant grape varieties, earlier harvests, and new locations. The wine industry is also grappling with its social and environmental impact. Wine production uses significant water resources, particularly in arid regions. Pesticides and fertilizers from vineyards can pollute waterways. The carbon footprint of shipping wine globally is substantial. Labour practices in vineyards, particularly in the New World, have faced scrutiny over low wages and poor conditions for seasonal workers. Wine's romantic image as a product of sun-drenched hillsides and family traditions obscures these industrial realities. Yet wine continues to evolve and influence. Natural wine, made with minimal intervention and often with unusual characteristics like cloudiness or funky aromas, has developed a devoted following among younger drinkers seeking authenticity and rejecting commercialization. Alternative packaging, from cans to boxes to kegs, is making wine more casual and environmentally friendly. Wine tourism is a major industry, with regions like Napa, Bordeaux, and Tuscany drawing millions of visitors who want to experience wine at its source. Wine has also become a form of cultural expression and identity. Wine from Georgia is experiencing a renaissance, with traditional Kvevari winemaking recognized by UNESCO as intangible cultural heritage. Small regions like Slovenia, Croatia, and Armenia are using wine to tell their stories and establish their place in the global market. Indigenous winemakers in places like New Zealand and Australia are reclaiming viticulture as part of their heritage and sovereignty. The story of wine is ultimately a story about humans trying to capture something ephemeral and make it last. Wine is sunshine and soil, transformed by fermentation into something more than its parts. It's chemistry and agriculture, but also art and culture. It's a commodity and a sacrament, an investment and a simple pleasure, a tradition stretching back millennia and an industry constantly evolving. Wine has been present at nearly every important moment in Western history. It fueled Greek philosophy, funded Roman expansion, survived the Dark Ages in monasteries, financed medieval cities, was declared the blood of Christ, drove exploration and colonization, survived ecological catastrophe, and became a global industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It's been used to seal treaties, celebrate victories, mourn losses, mark marriages, and consecrate religious rituals. More than any other beverage, wine has been intertwined with civilization itself. Beer is older and more universal. Spirits are more potent. Tea and coffee have their own rich histories, but wine uniquely combines antiquity, religious significance, geographic specificity, aging potential, and cultural prestige. Wine isn't just something people drink, it's something they study, collect, argue about, and build their identities around. The influence of wine on humanity is difficult to overstate. It shaped economies, funding cities and empires through trade and taxation. It influenced religion, becoming central to Christianity and important in other faiths. It drove agricultural innovation as winemakers experimented with cultivation, fermentation, and storage. It fostered science as chemists studied fermentation and microbiologists discovered yeast. It inspired art, literature, and music. It created social rituals, from Greek symposia to French wine dinners to modern wine tastings. Wine also tells us something profound about human nature. We're not satisfied with mere sustenance. We want pleasure, complexity, variety. We want to transform the natural world into something that reflects our values and aspirations. We want our drinks to have stories, to connect us to place and tradition, to be worthy of contemplation and conversation. Wine satisfies these very human desires. Looking forward, wine faces challenges but also opportunities. Climate change is forcing adaptations but also opening new regions. Changing consumer preferences, particularly among younger generations who drink less alcohol overall, are pushing the industry to innovate. Sustainability concerns are driving better practices. Technology is enabling precision viticulture that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. But through all these changes, wine retains its essential character. It's still grapes, fermented, bottled, and enjoyed. It's still a drink that tastes of its place and vintage, that changes with time, that brings people together. It's still something that can be simple or complex, cheap or expensive, everyday or special. The story of wine is far from over. New chapters are being written in unexpected places, from English sparkling wine to Chinese wine regions, to vineyards at the edge of the Sahara Desert. Each bottle tells a story about the soil it grew in, the climate of its vintage, the choices of its winemaker, and the culture that produced it. Wine became humanity's most influential drink, not through accident, but through a unique combination of qualities. Its complexity rewards attention and expertise, creating connoisseurship. Its connection to place creates terroir and regional identity. Its ability to age transforms it from agriculture into art. Its role in religion gave it sacred significance. Its economic importance funded empires and enriched merchants. Its presence at social gatherings facilitated conversation, negotiation, and bonding. From ancient Georgian Cuvée to modern Napa Cabernet, from communion chalices to investment portfolios, from peasant table wine to auction house trophies, wine has been humanity's constant companion through 8,000 years of history. It's been there for our greatest achievements and our worst disasters, our holiest moments and our most profane celebrations. It's shaped how we eat, how we socialize, how we worship, and how we think about agriculture, craft, and luxury. This is how wine became humanity's most influential drink, not through force or necessity, but through its unique ability to be simultaneously simple and complex, ancient and modern, universal and particular, practical and transcendent. It's a drink that has always been more than just a drink, and that's why it continues to captivate us, generation after generation, vintage after vintage.